that the Karma plant had military potential. In 1972, I wrote it in National Suicide. I said as much in Miami Beach in 1972. This plant has military potential. It can produce military vehicles. We knew it. And of course today in Afghanistan we find that the Karma vehicles that are there in Afghanistan today from the Karma plant built by American and Italian companies.
And it was after you brought out this information that efforts were made to suppress your book, National Suicide,
yes.
and your other studies?
Yes, because I was bringing out the fact that the Karma River plant had military potential, that we were moving the missiles with the Bryant chucking grinder equipment, and of course other facts along these lines.
And what sort of pressure was brought to bear upon you? What sort of pressure was brought to bear upon the publisher of your book, National Suicide?
There was pressure on the publisher to prevent publication, to stop publication. He refused to do so. There's pressure brought upon me first to withdraw the book, and then a rather deceitful sort of pressure. It was claimed at the Hoover Institution that I had plagiarized Volume 3 of my Western Technology series, which was being published by Stanford University. Well, firstly, I challenged them to point out the plagiarization, and nobody could find even two sentences that matched up. But then I pointed out that I cannot plagiarize my own work. I hold the copyright on both books, and nowhere in the world can I plagiarize myself. That's a logical impossibility. And then gradually it built up over the following years that my research was perhaps going a little out of what was perhaps required, or welcome would be a better word, and it should be confined within more narrow boundaries. And at that point in 1975 I left the Hoover Institution, and since then I've become an independent author, and I can publish what I want to publish.
Do you know of any other instances where efforts were made to suppress publication of books through the Hoover Institute?
I know of one example, one I was personally aware of, and that was Julius Epstein's book on Operation Keelhaul, which is a very important book on the treatment of Russian prisoners of war in Germany after World War II. This book was in manuscript for several years, and he was not allowed to publish it. I heard that firsthand from Julius.
Right, and eventually it was, of course, brought out.
It was at a later point. Now, another example I can give is my own Western Technology series. The third volume of that was held in galleys for 1 year. Now, it costs a lot of money to hold a book in galleys, because when a book is in galleys, you want to get it out on the market to start recouping your investment. That book was held in galleys for 1 year because it was not politically wise or acceptable to publish it at that time, even though it was an academic book.
Now, you've done some fascinating studies on the Trilateral Commission. Can you tell us about the Trilateral Commission?
The Trilateral Commission is a private organization founded by David Rockefeller in 1973. It was essentially financed by Rockefeller and some of the foundations, Kettering Foundation, Danforth Foundation, Ford Foundation. Ford Foundation was a very major contributor. And the stated objective is to encourage discussion amongst what they call the trilateral regions. I should point out that of the 300 members, 1/3 come from the United States, 1/3 from Japan, and 1/3 from Europe. But in effect, I find that the actions of the Trilateral Commission are very much self-interested on the part of the international banking community in New York.
Now, as far as the Trilateral Commission's influence on the American government is concerned, it's been said that there was a very excessive representation of the Trilateral Commission in Jimmy Carter's cabinet and in Jimmy Carter's administration.
Well, excessive is rather an understatement. I think there's some 200 million people in the United States. There are only 77 trilateral members who are American. Out of that 77, I counted no fewer than 18 trilateralists. That's about 1/3 of the American trilateral contingent turns up in the Carter administration. Mr. Carter himself was a trilateral, Mr. Mondale, Mr. Brown, Mr. Vance, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Brown, Secretary of Defense. In other words, they occupy all the senior cabinet and sub-cabinet posts. In fact, there's some key committees, intelligence and defense committees, which are only comprised of trilaterals. So here you've got 77 Americans selected by one man, David Rockefeller, who's chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank, and we find that they turn up in the key controlling positions in Washington under the Carter administration.
And would this suggest to you that perhaps we do not select the government, that it is selected by these people who work behind the scenes?
you can come to no other conclusion. If you look today at who's running for office, you find Mr. Bush is a trilateral, you find Mr. Anderson is a trilateral, Mr. Carter is a trilateral.
We find articles appearing in Newsweek magazine, Time magazine, U.S. News and World Report, many of the major media telling us there's really nothing to be concerned about from the Trilateral Commission. Is there any interlock between the Trilateral Commission and the major media in the United States?
Yes, there is an interlock, particularly in the news media. For example, the Chicago Sun-Times, the executive editor there, James Hoogie, is a trilateral. You'll find Saul Linowitz is a director of Time magazine. And I think, yes, Henry Schacht is a director of CBS. So there very definitely is an interlock between the trilaterals and the media.
And perhaps this is the reason then that they rather play down the influence of the Trilateral Commission on contemporary American government.
Yes, I had a computer survey made of all articles that have been printed on the Trilateral Commission since 1973. I could find worldwide only 73 articles.
Now, what's the relationship between the Trilateral Commission and the Council on Foreign Relations?
Well, of course, the Council on Foreign Relations is a much older organization founded in 1920. I did a study in which I compared trilaterals with or without membership in the CFR, Council on Foreign Relations. I find there's something over 50% overlap.
In Senator Goldwater's book, With No Apologies, on page 280, he wrote, "The Trilateral Commission is intended to be the vehicle for multinational consolidation of the commercial and banking interests by seizing control of the political government of the United States."
Antony Sutton lives in seclusion now, as with so many men who have documented the influence of America's invisible government on our society. He lives with a certain amount of concern for his safety, because you see, those who have documented the fact that we have an invisible government and that both political parties in America are controlled by the same identical people, those people, of course, their lives are in danger. Let me point out that since 1953, all but one Secretary of State has come from the membership list of the Council on Foreign Relations. Since 1953, all but one Undersecretary of State has come from the membership list of the Council on Foreign Relations, and all but one Director of the Central Intelligence Agency. And every head of the Federal Reserve Board has come from the membership list of the Council on Foreign Relations. Of the last 9 American presidents, 6, possibly 7, have come from the membership list of the Council on Foreign Relations, which is indeed the invisible government of the United States. Now, to understand the background of how this all came about, I'd suggest our video, The Descent into Darkness, which will document the origins of the Council on Foreign Relations, originally from the secret society that Cecil Rhodes created in 1891. And of course then the various front organizations, the Round Table, the Royal Institute for International Affairs in England and throughout the British Commonwealth, and of course in America, the Council on Foreign Relations really is a front group for the American branch of the Round Table and for the J.P. Morgan banking interest. Now, if you'd like to document what I'm telling you, a wonderful book. It was written by Professor Carroll Quigley, who was Bill Clinton's mentor when Bill Clinton attended Georgetown University back in the 1960s. In fact, Professor Quigley was a liberal college professor who had a tremendous influence on many of his students, and Bill Clinton even mentioned Professor Quigley when he accepted the Democrat nomination for the presidency back in July of 1962. And when he was accepting the Democrat nomination, he talked about when he'd been a student, he'd heard John Kennedy's call to citizenship, and then as a student at Georgetown University, he heard that summons clarified by a professor named Carroll Quigley. Now, in 1966, Professor Quigley wrote a book entitled Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time, in which, in 1,348 pages, he outlined the entire history of modern times and the secret society which had come to dominate the American government. The book was published by Macmillan Company. In fact, it was so revealing that almost immediately the publishing house was bought up, and someone who worked for the new publisher destroyed the plates to the first half of Professor Quigley's book.